So, can you hear me at the back? Thank you. So, hello everybody, welcome, very warm welcome, especially warm welcome if this is your first time on Tuesday at Sangha night. So, for the next 12 weeks or so, we're going to be looking at a teaching called the 7 Points of Training the Mind. And this is a sort of set of pithy, powerful, radical instructions intended to transform the way we think and speak and act in the midst of the hurly-burly of everyday life, not just when we're on retreat, into the way someone who had overcome the delusion of separate selfhood would think and speak and act. So you could say, in a sense, that this is a teaching about how to play at being a bodhisattva. The ideal Buddhist. The word bodhisattva obviously has got two parts, Bodhi, sattva. Bodhi means something like awakening wisdom, awakened wisdom, and sattva means being. Okay, so bodhisattva, someone who is often translated as awakening being, someone who's not fully enlightened yet, but well on the right path. And by taking up these practices, we play at being a bodhisattva. And let's not dismiss that as kids' stuff, playing. Children play at being a hero or a doctor or cooperating with others on a team, and they play as a way of developing the qualities that they want and need to have as an adult. So we play at being a bodhisattva as a way of developing the qualities of a bodhisattva. And this practice comes to us via the Tibetan tradition. And the Tibetans talk about there being three aspects to this practice. Vision or view, attitude, and action or practice. So the view or the vision is the view of Anatman, which you've come across on the 6th week of the introductory course, if not otherwise. The fact that we do not exist as separate, isolated selves. We are completely interconnected with the world around us and with other beings. We are all part of each other, and our sense of being a separate self cut off from others is a delusion. So that's the vision. That's the vision that underlies this practice, the interconnectedness of all beings and all things. The second aspect is what's called the attitude. The attitude to living and practicing the Dharma that expresses that vision, that sort of drops out of that vision naturally. And in the Tibetan tradition, they tend to call this bodhicitta. Again, two parts, bodhi, awakened wisdom, chitta, heart and mind. So bodhicitta could be translated as awakened heart or awakening heart. And this word bodhicitta seems to cover a multitude of meanings. It can mean something transpersonal and very, very exalted. But as a sort of personal attitude, it's usually described simply as the desire to practice the Dharma and gain enlightenment for the sake of all beings, not just for oneself. We could say it's the attitude of practicing and living to benefit others as much as we benefit ourselves, which of course is only logical. It's only logical if we accept that we are completely interconnected with others, and that our sense of being separate from them is a delusion. If we accept this, we try to care as much about others as we care about ourselves. Our Buddhist practice becomes about us becoming enlightened. Not just about me becoming enlightened so I can be even more special than I am already. And have an even bigger ego. Of course, practicing and living that way doesn't mean that we ignore ourselves. We also do the things that raise our own level of being. We practice ethics, we meditate, we reflect, we study the Dharma, because we can only help others if we grow, so that we stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution. And in fact, practicing in this way, as much for others as for oneself, we actually make more progress than we would if we just focused on ourselves. Enlightenment means going beyond our present small self. And so there's a serious contradiction involved in trying to seek enlightenment by focusing just on our own small self and its own benefit. So the famous Tibetan teacher Sangha, our 14th century Tibetan teacher, said, there's a flaw in practicing just for ourselves that means we do not benefit others and we do not even benefit ourselves. There is a strength in practicing for others, which means that we benefit others and we also benefit ourselves. So, or more succinctly, in the words of Sangha, our founder, there is no such thing as an individualistic enlightenment. Same meaning. We all probably start out our practice trying to benefit ourselves, have better mental states, be happier, etc. But to continue making progress past a certain point, we need to become as much about others as we are about ourselves. So that's the basis of this practice. The vision of Anatman and interconnectedness, seeing that we don't exist as separate selves, but are totally connected to others. And then the attitude that drops out of that, that we practice and live to benefit others as much as we do to benefit ourselves. But that could all be incredibly vague and heavy. It's a bit like the last stage of the Metta Bhavana, I love everybody, but I don't like them. It could all be incredibly vague and heavy. So we need the last of those three aspects of the practice. Practice, action. How do we put that vision and that attitude into practice this very day, in this very situation, with this very person that we're with at the moment? And that is mainly what the mind training teachings are all about. How should we think and speak and act right now, this very day, in everyday life, with all its problems and difficulties, so that we act as if we were already well on the way to enlightenment, as if we were already a bodhisattva. And acting as if is a sort of well-established Buddhist principle, if you like. And the thing about acting as if we were a more enlightened being is that we're doing it, we become more like an enlightened being. And we have a positive effect on the world at the same time, to the extent that we manifest awakening just by our actions. We become a channel for awakened wisdom. We have an effect on other people and the world. So the mind training sets out to give us some detailed, practical instructions for thinking, speaking, and acting as if we really knew the truth of interconnectedness in our bones, and as if that was reflected in our overall attitude to life. I'll say more about that later, but first I'm going to go into a bit of history, because the story tells us just how lucky we are to have these teachings here in Sheffield in the 21st century. Incredible bit of luck, and so it's worth knowing the story about that luck. So when you look at the text later, you'll see that the first line, there's a first line is something like homage to the great compassionate one. Buddhist texts often start with something like that. We need to be in a receptive mode, not sort of picking, do I agree with this? We need to be in a receptive mode. We're hearing something from a higher level of being, if you like. And then it goes on, this elixir-like instruction is transmitted from Serlingpa, which probably sounds complete gobbledygook. The teaching is called an elixir because it's highly concentrated, like really strong medicine, effective, strong stuff, maybe even challenging. Maybe it's got, I don't like the taste of that. It might seem outrageous and shocking because it cuts across quite a lot of common present-day attitudes. So this elixir-like instruction is transmitted from Sir Lingpa. So Sir Lingpa means he of the Golden Isle. And this teaching originated with someone called Dharmakirti, he of the Golden Isle, because he lived in Sumatra, which was called the Golden Isle. And Sumatra is part of Indonesia, and in the 10th century, when this was developed, that was a great center of Buddhism. So you might have seen images of the great sort of mandala pyramid at Borobudur in Indonesia, great sort of wonderful thing, which was buried for ages and only fairly recently been unearthed. So there's Dharmakirti, Sir Lingpa, he of the Golden Isle. And another great figure in the mind training tradition is Atisha, who was born in Bengal in very exact 982 of the Christian era. Atisha is said to have had a vision of Dharmakirti while he was meditating at Bodh Gaya, the place of the Buddha's enlightenment. And in this vision, he was told to go to Sumatra and learn from Dharmakirti. Learn the mind training tradition from Dharmakirti. So he undertook that long and hazardous journey. We're talking about quite a dangerous and long journey with the sort of boats they had in those days. And he then spent 12 years as a disciple of Dharmakirti. And at the end of those 12 years, he returned to India and became a famous figure in his own right. He became the abbot of one of the great monastic universities in northern India. And from there, his fame spread to Tibet. And the king of Tibet invited him to come to Tibet. He invited him several times to come to Tibet to help to re-establish Buddhism in that country. So Buddhism, the Dharma, had been introduced to Tibet, I think, in the 8th century, but it had degenerated. It had degenerated into sort of shamanism and village magic. So the king wanted to re-establish the true Dharma in Tibet. But Atisha was very reluctant to go. By this time, he was in his 50s. He got a nice, comfortable life being abbot of a big monastery. And Tibet was a harsh, cold, primitive place. But then one day, in his meditation, it is said that the archetypal bodhisattva, Tara, bodhisattva of active compassion, appeared to him and told him that if he went to Tibet, it would shorten his life, but it would greatly benefit the world. So, at the age of 55, he decided to go to Tibet, taking the mind training with him, teachings with him. And he remained in Tibet until his death at the age of 72. He rejuvenated Buddhism in Tibet, completely rejuvenated it. And he which had become quite debased, and he passed on the mind training traditions to his disciples. They were then passed down through the generations of practitioners and eventually were taken up by all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism as an important part of their practice, and by us in Triratna. So Atisha going to Tibet when he did was very, very lucky for us. Because not long after he went to Tibet, Muslim armies swept through India and on into Indonesia, wiping out Buddhism as they went. So it is only because Atisha went to Indonesia and then to the safety of Tibet exactly when he did, that we have the teachings we have today. And I personally, I'm really glad about that. I'm really glad about that, grateful for that, because this teaching has been very, very important for me. I first came across the 7-point mind training when I was doing door-to-door fundraising in London, working with a guy called Tim Lilly, who established the way our charity, Karuna Trust, does fundraising. If you get a chance to join a Karuna fundraising appeal, I would really recommend you do it, because it has been transformative for me, and I think I know it's been transformative for many others as well. But When you knock on somebody's door in the evening, in the dark and the cold, on your own, and ask them to think about giving regular amounts of money to a charity they've never heard of, you need to work to stay in positive mental states. You can absolutely expect that sometimes people are going to be rude and offensive. They're going to belittle you. They're going to treat you like a salesperson or a beggar, or just be angry with you for disturbing their meal and their cooking, whatever. And if you're going to be effective at this, you need to just let that wash off you. Teflon coated, except with no forever chemicals. But anyway, if you're going to be effective, you need to just let it wash off you. So that, you need to let go of any feelings of offense or blame or anger. And instead of focusing on you and the affront to your identity, if you fundraise this way, you need to make it all about them, about the people you're calling on. So you get your attention off yourself, off your own pride and ego and your desires, and you put your attention on the people you're calling on to connect with them and make the interaction as pleasant for them as possible, if they're open to it. That is what you focus on. You focus on that, not trying to get them to give money. And I am not the humblest or the most even-tempered person in the world, naturally. And I think the only thing that allowed me to do this was this practice of the Sevenfold Mind training. Because this practice is precisely about letting go of all that ego stuff like offense and blame and offended pride, and being more about connecting with others than about oneself, or as concerned for others as oneself. I actually think this sort of fundraising has got a lot in common with the early Buddhist practice of sleeping in the open and begging for food. The early bhikkhus made themselves low status and vulnerable to offense from others, living in the open, dressing in rags and begging for their food. And I think that must have required the same sort of approach that we're hearing about in the 7-Point Mind training. So as I said earlier, the mind training tradition sets out to give us some detailed, practical instructions for thinking, speaking, and acting as if we really knew the truth. The truth of interconnectedness, as if we knew that in our bones, and if that was reflected in our daily life. So how does it tell us to do this? What does it say? Well, we're going to go into a lot more detail over the next weeks about individual bits of it. But tonight, I'll just try to give a bit of an overview of some of the content. For a start, you'll see when you get the text, one of the very first lines is turn adversity into the path to enlightenment, turn adversity into the path of practice. It advises us to turn what we think of as adverse conditions into the path to enlightenment. It advises us to see bad things happening as an opportunity rather than a problem. If we were more awakened, we would see clearly that making spiritual growth is more important for our own benefit and for the benefit of others than fleeting sensory pleasures, having money and possessions, getting approval and avoiding blame, having a high worldly status. We would see that those things are less important than spiritual growth. And we would see that we cannot grow unless we have some difficulty and challenge in our life. If life is just a constant round of pleasure and getting what we want, then we just stagnate. Why should we change? We just stagnate. So our hypothetical bodhisattva would see very clearly that what they once regarded as bad things happening are in fact good, because these are opportunities to grow. like the Dalai Lama says or said, Chairman Mao is my greatest friend, and being chucked out of Tibet was the best thing that happened to us. That's that attitude. That comes directly from this sort of teaching. So if we were a bodhisattva, we would think very, very differently about difficult circumstances or difficult, unpleasant people. We would turn what we now think of as adverse, bad situations into that path to enlightenment. And the mind training asks us to do that now. As if we were already awakened being. And as part of that, as part of the ways of doing that, it gives us ways of transforming what Buddhists call dukkha. You've come across dukkha, I'm sure, from something negative into something positive. So dukkha often translated as suffering, but that's not quite right. A lot of dukkha isn't as extreme as suffering. The tradition distinguishes at least, several kinds of dukkha. There's physical discomfort or pain, which, like it or not, we're going to have if we've got a body. Then there is mental suffering, which can be intense, but which we often bring upon ourselves about the way we use our mind. And then there is the dukkha of change, the fact that even when things seem to be going well, we know this is impermanent. We're on holiday and we know that the holiday will come to end on Saturday, so Friday isn't quite as enjoyable as it might be. Holidays don't last, and they're neither the youth, health, pleasure, or life. And because we know all that, somewhere at the back of our minds, there's often a shadow. There's a shadow over our present experience, the dukkha of change. And so there's physical suffering, mental suffering, the dukkha of change. And then finally, there's something that we often call existential suffering. The fact that worldly existence can never offer us complete satisfaction. It always seems like there should be more to life, even when it's all sorted, because we're essentially spiritual beings. If we were always on the most wonderful holiday, with everything we want provided, no tasks or responsibilities or challenges, surrounded by people, beautiful people, we would get bored. We would start to think, is this it? Is this all there is? So there's also this existential dukkha, a sort of groundswell of dissatisfaction with worldly life and a longing for something higher. And the Buddhist tradition tells that dukkha is inevitable. So if we are wise, we accept and face it. And we don't cause ourselves even more dukkha by getting in negative mental states about it, or by running away from it into craving and dissatisfaction, which in the long run just causes more suffering. Craving and distraction, I should say. So the mind training tells us to face the reality of dukkha, and it also tells us how to turn dukkha into something positive. To start with, it advises us to let go of blaming, completely let go of blaming. Stop blaming other people or the government or whatever for our dukkha. Dukkha is just there. But consider that the real cause of much of our dukkha is our own ego clinging. That is just basic Buddhism. The Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths. Noble Truth number 2 tells us that the cause of our dukkha is selfish craving. So to act as a wiser being, we would stop blaming others for our dukkha and blame our own ego clinging and try and deal with that. So we stop causing ourselves even more dukkha, but the mind training teaching goes beyond that, and it offers us ways to transform dukkha, to use dukkha as a way to connect with others, rather than doing what we usually do when we're suffering, which is focus on ourselves, collapse in on ourselves. It offers us a way to do this in meditation by realizing that we all suffer, we all experience dukkha, our own suffering is something that we have in common with everyone. If I have a toothache right now, so do many, many, many other people have a toothache right now. And I can use that as a way of connecting with all those other people. So the teaching gives us a way to do that in meditation. And when we can take that practice off our cushion, off our meditation cushion, and use it in everyday life. We can use it in the dentist waiting room, in the traffic jam. We can make situations like these not about my anxiety or my frustration, but about connecting with all the others around me who are feeling exactly the same. And in this way, the dentist waiting room or the traffic jam become profitable experiences. And they even become pleasant experiences because there is so much pleasure in the experience of metta and connecting with others. So we can turn bad experiences into the path to enlightenment by compassion, connecting with others. And the teaching also gives us ways of doing that by wisdom. By seeing that bad or adverse circumstances, that's just a label we've invented. It's a story we're telling. And we can let go of our stories and sit more lightly to events, not make it also deadly serious when we don't get what we want or whatever. So these are some big changes we could make in the way that we live our life, but that's not enough. That's not enough. We might decide really firmly, I am going to practice this. I am going to practice this. I'm going to put in place all the teachings that this recommends, make all of these changes. But there's some research that shows that almost all New Year's resolutions are forgotten by February. We have deep, deep habit energies that keep us running on the same tracks, keep us going back to the same patterns of behavior. And if we're going to make changes that stick, we need some help. And luckily, the Dharma incorporates a lot of wisdom about the way the human mind and the human heart work. And the mind training tradition uses this to give us the help that we need to make changes happen. For one thing, there's a few things, but for one thing, it gives us a teaching called the 5 Forces, my favorite teaching, nearly, which tells us the steps we need to go through to actually make the things we decide to do happen and to keep on happening. This is, as I said, it's one of my favorite teachings. It's even rather fun. And later in this series, we'll be using it to make some changes that we would like to make in our lives. We'll be practicing those 5 forces to make some changes that we want to make. And finally, on a very down-to-earth level, the text helps us to put our decisions into practice by giving what are usually called slogans, little pithy reminders that we can use to stay mindful of the things we've chosen to do and want to do, so that our intentions are not drowned out by the noise and hurly-burly of everyday life. The 7-point mind training, one of the lines is, use slogans to train in all activities. And it's rather famous for its slogans. You can buy packs of slogan cards and all sorts of things like that. It's rather famous for its slogans. Each week, we're going to give out a card with one of those slogans, I think. And we're going to challenge, and you'll be challenged to put that into practice in your life, okay? So the mind training is a practical tradition. So I'd like to suggest some practical homework we could do in the week ahead to canter up to the sort of changes in the territory of the mind training. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to get bored. Boredom is dukkha. Set aside some time to do absolutely nothing this week, and you'll probably experience that sort of groundswell of dukkha. Not happy with my own mind, so dukkha, in the form of boredom. So notice, take some time out to do nothing and notice what your reaction is. Do you reach for any distraction you can find? The phone is the favorite of the moment. Might once have been the TV thingy or the bottle of beer. What do you do? What do you do? What do you want to do? What's the immediate impulse when you're bored? Or do you feel annoyed and you want to blame somebody? Probably me. He made me do this. So how about that for homework? And maybe more generally, just notice this week how you usually react when you experience discomfort or pain or inconvenience or disappointment. Try just notice your reactions and feelings, like watching clouds move across the sky, like mental weather, just watching them without acting on them. Being in the gap, we call that, I believe. And you might want to discuss in your groups later on, you might want to discuss the ways you tend to react to dukkha. Anger, craving for distraction, what is it? So then finally, the very last verse of the mind training text tells us, this teaching is the essence of the sutras and tantras. Profound yet simple. It is difficult to hear deep teaching like this, as rare as finding buried treasure. So it's the essence, it's very boiled down, of the sutras. The sutras are the texts of Mahayana Buddhism, which you'll come across if you haven't already, but there's wonderful texts, loads of them. And the tantras, of course, is one of the later stages of Buddhism where, well, I don't know, I haven't got time to go into it, but it's exciting. This teaching is the essence of the sutras and tantras. And it's the essence of the sutras because the vision and attitude that underlies the sutras is that very interconnectedness and that desire to benefit others as well as oneself by one's practice. And it's that precisely the same vision and attitude that underlies the mind training. The mind training just tells us how to put that into practice. And it's the essence of the tantras because tantric Buddhism often emphasizes bringing the goal into the present moment, acting now as if we were already enlightened, even when that seems outrageous, rather than putting that off for some future time when we're more developed. I'll be more loving then, rather than, or more equanimous later. Well, just do it now. Manifest it now. And also the tantras are very much about transforming what is usually regarded as worthless or negative into something positive, which of course the mind training is also about. So the essence of the sutras and tantras, profound yet simple. It is difficult to hear deep teaching like this, as rare as finding buried treasure. We are so lucky that it's come down to us because of our teachers' practice, sacrifices, events many hundreds of years ago. And I think we're in for a bit of a treat as we go over the mind training tradition in the next few weeks.